In this part, we're going to deploy to Kubernetes cluster from Jenkins Pipeline. So first of all, we have the cluster already running on AWS. This is the cluster that we created, an EKS cluster with 2 worker nodes. So this is the cluster we're going to be deploying into. Currently, the cluster is empty. We don't have any pods running. We don't have any services. It is a fresh new cluster, so we can start deploying applications inside. And there are a couple of things that we need to do in order to deploy from Jenkins Pipeline directly into EKS Cluster. And we're going to do all this step by step. First of all, we're going to need to install kubectl command line tool inside Jenkins container, because we're going to be executing kubectl commands within the pipeline. So we need that command to be available when running Jenkins Pipeline. And the way we're going to do that is directly installing the tool inside Jenkins container. Another command line tool that we're going to need to install inside Jenkins container, and this is specific to AWS, is AWS IAM Authenticator. So basically, when we try to connect to the Kubernetes cluster that is running on AWS, we're going to need to authenticate not only with Kubernetes cluster, but also with AWS, because the cluster is running on AWS account. So basically, both of these command line tools need to be installed and available for Jenkins so that they get executed in the background when we run our pipeline. Once we install those 2 command line tools, then we're going to need to create a Kubernetes config file for connecting to the cluster. So basically, this is an alternative to creating credentials inside Jenkins, which we used to do using Jenkins UI. Now we're going to go inside Jenkins container directly, and we're going to create a config file that will contain all the information it needs in order to authenticate with AWS account using the AWS IAM Authenticator command line tool, and also with the EKS cluster that we have created. So we're going to manually create this file. This is basically the same file that we're using locally to execute kubectl commands. So on our local machines, when we created EKS cluster, you saw that kube folder got generated and this config file automatically got installed there, right? So that basically configured kubectl on our local machines to talk to the EKS cluster. And that config file basically contains all the necessary information for authentication. And also, when you create EKS cluster using EKS control tool, it automatically installs AWS IAM Authenticator for you. So you don't have to do that manually. And that means I have kubectl and I have AWS IAM Authenticator installed locally. And I have this .kube/config file, and this combination makes it possible for me to execute kubectl locally and connect to the EKS cluster as we saw earlier. So basically, we need to do exactly the same inside the Jenkins container so that Jenkins can do the same as well. And there is one final thing that we need to configure for this authentication to happen, because as I mentioned, we're not only connecting and authenticating with the Kubernetes cluster in EKS, but also authenticating and connecting to AWS account. And that means we need AWS credentials as well. So we have AWS user that we use to create the cluster, and each user on AWS has an access key ID and secret access key. And we need these credentials in order to connect to our cluster. So we need basically a bunch of configuration just to be able to authenticate with AWS and the cluster running inside there. And once we are done configuring all this, we're gonna, as a final step, basically just adjust Jenkins file and execute kubectl command from inside there. So let's get started. First of all, we're gonna need kubectl command to be available on Jenkins server, so we can actually execute kubectl commands from the Jenkins pipeline. So the first thing is we're going to install kubectl on Jenkins server, which in our case is a Docker container. So we're going to install kubectl inside Docker container where Jenkins is running. So I have made sure that my DigitalOcean droplet that is hosting the Jenkins server is up and running, and that the Docker container is running as well. So here we can see the Jenkins server, and we're going to SSH into that server. So we are on DigitalOcean droplet. Let's do Docker PS. And here, as you see, Jenkins container is running. Now we're going to enter the Jenkins container because we need to install kubectl inside the container. So we're going to do docker exec, and we're going to enter as a root user because Jenkins user doesn't have admin permissions. So we're going to need root permissions for this installation. Interactive terminal, the container ID, and bash. Awesome, we're inside the container. And right now we don't have kubectl installed. And now we're going to install kubectl inside. So I'm going to execute a curl command, which will download kubectl from the official source with the latest stable version. Then we're executing chmod command on the kubectl executable. And then we're moving that executable to this location inside the container. So now if I do kubectl version, there you go, you see the version of kubectl, and obviously we're not connected to any cluster, so we get authentication required. But kubectl command is available, so as you've already learned in the Jenkins module, whenever we need some tool, command line tool to execute commands with inside our pipeline, we can actually install them directly on Jenkins server or inside the Jenkins container, and they will be available as Linux commands inside the pipeline. So we can actually execute them pretty simply. So now we have kubectl command available in our pipeline. So the first step is done, and we can move on to the next one. So now that we have kubectl installed, we need to install another tool. We're not going to need it for all the Kubernetes clusters, but this is specific to AWS EKS. And you saw that when we created an EKS cluster, we actually got a kubeconfig, which basically contains all the secrets and all the certificates, etc., for authenticating and connecting to the cluster. It also contains all the information to connect to the cluster on AWS specifically, to the EKS cluster. So basically, we are going to provide Jenkins with all the credentials, necessary stuff. However, we need kubectl and AWS IAM Authenticator both to actually connect to a Kubernetes cluster and authenticate to it from Jenkins. So let's go ahead and do that as well. The installation is actually pretty similar. We are also going to just download the authenticator using curl. And once it is downloaded, and we can check that as well, right here I have the executable. We're going to edit execute permission, very similar to what we did with kubectl. And now that we have execute permissions on it, we're going to move it to the same local folder. And there you go. So we have AWS IAM Authenticator. Let's actually try to execute it, and the command is available. So we have both kubectl and IAM Authenticator installed so that Jenkins can use it to connect to the EKS cluster. Let's go ahead and create the kubeconfig file manually. First of all, we don't have an editor inside the Jenkins container because it's a lightweight container and it doesn't have many tools installed. So we're going to create that file outside on the host on our DigitalOcean droplet, and then we're going to just simply copy that inside the Docker container. So let's go ahead and create that file. Let's call it config. And these are the contents of that file, which basically I can just copy from the AWS documentation. So these are the file contents, and there are three things that we need to change here, three values. The first one is the cluster name. So basically we want to define here which cluster we want to connect to. And we called our cluster demo cluster. The second value that we need to change is server endpoint. And we can get that information very easily from the EKS view on Management Console. So in the details, we have API server endpoint, which is the public endpoint for talking to the cluster. This is the API server of Kubernetes. So whenever we're trying to connect to Kubernetes cluster from outside the cluster or outside the VPC, either using kubectl or browser or whatever client, we can use this public endpoint. So let's copy that and set it as a server URL here. And the final value that we need to change is certificate authority data. This is something that gets generated in EKS Cluster when it gets created. And we actually have that file already available locally in our local kubeconfig file, which EKS control created for us. So I'm gonna go to another tab and I can actually just print out .kubeconfig. This is my local copy. I'm on my host. And if I scroll up, here you see certificate authority data. This is exactly what we need. So I'm going to copy that. And by the way, you also see the server URL here. We could have copied that as well. So I'm going to take that and copy it right here. This is already base64 encoded. And the config file is ready. Let's actually save it. And now we need to make this file available inside Jenkins container at the default kubeconfig location. And the default kubeconfig location, as you saw, is .kube/config inside the user's home directory, right? This is right here in my home directory locally. So we need to copy that into Jenkins user's home directory inside the Jenkins container. So let's actually enter Jenkins container. So I am a Jenkins user now, and if I do cd and tilde, I'm gonna move into Jenkins home directory. And if I do pwd, you see /var/Jenkins_home is actually the home directory of the Jenkins user. So we're gonna need to copy this config file from Droplet server into the container on this path inside a .kube directory. So first of all, let's create this .kube directory inside Jenkins home folder. And now I'm gonna actually leave the container, and very easily using docker copy command, I can take the source file, which is config. This is DigitalOcean server, so we are on the server, and let's copy it inside a container. So let's take the container ID. That's the destination. Inside the container, into var Jenkins home directory, we have kube, and we're gonna copy that inside. So now let's enter the Jenkins container again. And if I move into my home directory here on Jenkins and do ls, actually ls -a because it's a hidden folder. So we have .kube here, and inside that .kube, we have our config file. And we can print it out. Again, we have the server API because kubectl needs to know where to connect to the server or on which URL it should find the cluster it needs to connect to. The certificate authority data that basically authenticates it with Kubernetes. And here we're using AWS IAM Authenticator command in order to handle the authentication with AWS. So that part is done. Let's actually leave Docker container. Now, one thing that is missing is basically we need credentials for AWS user as well. As I said, locally we have worked with the admin user, which is an AWS user with its own secret key ID and access key, and we need to configure the same for Jenkins. Now, important to mention here, you don't have to use admin user, obviously, to execute these commands on Jenkins. You could go ahead and create a Jenkins user on AWS, so an IAM user for Jenkins specifically, which is actually kind of a best practice to create own dedicated Jenkins user for different services that Jenkins connects to and needs to authenticate to, including Docker repositories, AWS, Kubernetes, and so on, right? And then you can give that Jenkins user basically permissions or limited permissions, more limited permissions than an admin user for security reasons. Just for simplicity, in our case, we're going to go with the existing admin user because creating credentials is going to be exactly the same, whichever user you have. But first, I'm going to update the config of our multi-branch pipeline here and update the source project. I have forked the Java Maven app into the lectures project in Git, so I just need to change this to reflect that. So this bit here is going to change, and now I'll click Save and run a scan to update this in Jenkins. So the scan is complete, and as you can see here, I have added a new branch, a deploy on Kubernetes branch to the project for this demo, which now appears in our Jenkins pipeline. Awesome. So inside our pipeline, multi-branch pipeline, because it has its own credentials store, we're going to create credentials for this AWS user. So inside, we already have some credentials we used in the previous examples, and we're just going to add to that. And this time we're going to use kind secret text because we're going to create two credentials for each access key and secret key ID. And for admin user, we have both of these credentials locally, so we can look it up and copy it from there. So basically the credentials for active user on your command line on your laptop is going to be in home directory.aws folder, right? Just like we have the .cube folder or .docker folder, we have .aws folder where credentials are stored for the current user. So first I'm going to create AWS access key ID. We can also give it Jenkins prefix, assuming this is a user that Jenkins can use. And the secret is going to be the actual key ID. And let's create that. And now let's create another one for the access key, the secret access key. Again, we're going to choose secret text. Let's call it Jenkins AWS secret access key and the actual secret access key as a secret here. Let's create that one as well. And now both credentials are available for our multi-branch pipeline. So all the different configuration steps for the authentication requirements are done. We have credentials for authenticating with AWS, as well as for authenticating with the Kubernetes cluster. And with all of these configurations, we can now go ahead and create a Jenkins file that can execute kubectl command into the cluster and create some deployment there. So I'm back in my Java Maven app project, and I'm working in our new feature branch called deploy on Kubernetes. And I have a Jenkins file here, which is super basic. So basically, we are not doing anything yet, and we're going to be implementing the kubectl command execution in the deploy step here. So this is our entry point Jenkins file. So now let's add the kubectl step in the last stage here. So in the deploy stage, we're going to do And we're going to execute a shell command kubectl create deployment. Let's call the deployment nginx deployment and image equals nginx. So basically this just deploys an nginx deployment based on the nginx latest image inside the cluster. And we're able to execute the kubectl because we have it installed inside our Jenkins container. And with kubectl execution, the IAM authenticator will also get executed in the background. However, before this actually successfully connects to the AWS Kubernetes cluster, we need to set or export environmental variables that will be used in that connection. So on the same level as steps, we're going to define environment. And inside the environment block, we're going to basically export the Linux environmental variables that will be considered or used when executing this command here. So the first environmental variable we want to export is AWS access key ID. And we're going to assign its value from the credentials that we created. So the first credential for the access key ID is this one right here. We're going to take the ID of that and paste it in here. And the second environmental variable is AWS secret access key. And we're going to provide that also with credentials. Let's go back and copy that one as well. So what we're doing is basically we're setting those two environmental variables as a context for the kubectl command to execute. Because as I said, in the background, IAM authenticator will get executed, and that command will need AWS access credentials to connect to the AWS account. So that's why we're setting these environmental variables here. So for example, if I do AWS configure list, you see that access key and secret key are set because I have them in the .aws folder locally. And as an alternative, I can also set them as environmental variables in each context or in each terminal window to execute the AWS commands. And this is basically what we're doing right here. Because we don't have the .aws folder inside Jenkins, we need to set the credentials like this. So again, to summarize, kubectl command will get executed, which will use the config file that we have created in the default location of .kube/config. And inside that config file, it is configured that IAM authenticator needs to be used in order to authenticate with the AWS account. And when AWS IAM authenticator command gets triggered in the background as a result, it needs credentials to connect to the AWS. So those two will be used because we're setting them here as environmental variables. So with these changes in our Jenkins file, we can actually push this to the repository and build the pipeline for deploy on Kubernetes branch. So I'm going to add that and commit, add kubectl deploy, and let's push it. So the changes are in the Git repository, and now we can go back to Jenkins. And right now I have configured it to build all branches, and this includes many branches that I don't actually want to build now. So we can actually configure our pipeline for this new branch specifically. So only that branch will build essentially. Deploy on Kubernetes, that's how we called the branch. And save it, and it starts to scan it automatically. So let's refresh. And the pipeline is running already. And it is green, it got executed. Let's actually check the logs. There you go. kubectl create and deployment, nginx deployment created. If I go back to my terminal. This is my host, right? And I'm connected with the cluster. So if I do kubectl get pod, there you go. Nginx deployment pod got created and it is running. Now, also another important or interesting note here is that this part of authentication where we need the IAM authenticator command line and setting the AWS credentials, in addition to Kubernetes authentication, is actually specific to AWS. So different platforms manage it differently. So for example, if you're using a Linode managed Kubernetes service, you don't have to do any of this. You basically just directly authenticate with the Kubernetes cluster and that's it. You don't have to authenticate with Linode separately. So basically you save this step, and I'm going to show you this in another video so you can see how that works in comparison. Or if you're running Kubernetes cluster on bare metal, so basically you're going to have a platform, but rather you just have Kubernetes cluster running on some servers. Again, you won't need to do this additional step and then also installing the IAM authenticator. You would just need that Kubernetes config file that kubectl will use to authenticate with the Kubernetes cluster. So just to bear that in mind.